Hey everyone, Brendan Snyder here. How are you? Thank you for joining me and welcome to the biggest album fails from the last 40 years. Part 1, there will be a part 2 that's going to post tomorrow, so keep an eye out for that. But it's nothing new that bands want to try new things and, step outside of their comfort zone, that sort of a thing. And sometimes it works, like when U2 changed just about everything about themselves and hit pay dirt with Octoon Baby becoming one of their biggest albums ever. But that's a real rarity. That doesn't often happen. Usually the change ends up being off-putting, and sometimes that miscalculated step can really become almost unrecoverable for a band, creating some of the biggest album fails. And so we're going to run through 10 of those right now as part of episode 1 here. As I said, there will be a part 2 to this that'll post tomorrow, so keep an eye out for that. But before we get started, if you're new to my channel and you haven't already hit the subscribe button, please click it. Also leave a comment, hit like. All those things help support my channel. I would greatly appreciate it. And of course, as an added bonus, by subscribing, you'll be able to stay up to date on really cool episodes just like this with the biggest album fails from the last 40 years, part 1. So as part of this, we are going to go through, start with the letter A, we're going to run through M, and then in part 2, it will pick up with M again and run through the rest of the alphabet. Kicking off here, we are starting with Aerosmith, Honkin' on Bobo from 2004. 14th studio album from the band. It's the one that killed their forward momentum that they had had since the late 80s there with Permanent Vacation and The Pump. Get a Grip, their biggest selling album of that era, 7 million copies. And this here doing an all blues covers album, well, save for one track, The Grind, that was an original song on here, but it just ground everything to a halt. Now, in theory, Aerosmith, a blues rock band doing an all blues covers album, should have been hugely successful. They had certainly had success covering blues songs like Train Kept a Rollin' and stuff like that. But my thing is, what really lacked here was that they did not put the Aerosmith stamp on these blues covers. They just felt uninspired, and without Steven Tyler's voice being on these, to me, anybody could have been the ones covering it. I didn't really hear anything in here that made these tracks stand out. There was a couple that I did like. Roadrunner was really good. Baby Please Don't Go. But the rest of the tracks on here, not so much. All right, next one up, Bon Jovi, Bounce from 2002, their 8th studio album and follow-up to their 2 million selling album or comeback album, Crush. It was really big for them. So you'd think a band that was on this forward momentum like that would just, stick with what works. And even though that album was a bit of a modernization for the band itself, here they go and attempt to change their sound again. This one, I think they just went too far with it, updating their sound with drum loops and samples and backbeats and things of that nature. They just didn't really work with it, and due to that change in sound, trying to become the more modern style that they were in and some of the lyrics and things, I ended up just feeling that this album here came off a bit too contrived, and it's just not one that I go back to all that often. Next up, The Clash and Cut the Crap from 1985. This was their 6th and final studio album. It was the follow-up to also their most commercial album, Combat Rock, which came out in 1982. That one sold 2 million copies, but this one here couldn't even muster gold. The other thing is it only had 2 original members, and that probably had a lot to do with it here. They lost one of their vocalists, Mick Jones. Joe Strummer was the only remaining vocalist at that point. And of course, the change in sound here didn't help on this, using synth drums, loops, with much more 80s style production on here. And for me, they just lost that raw punk character that was the thing that I think drew a lot of people into it. And that just really ended up hurting this album here amongst their fans. Next one, The Cure, Wild Mood Swings from 1996, 9th studio album, follow-up to the platinum-selling Wish, which happens to be my favorite of the Cure albums. But this one here was just kind of completely different than anything else that the band had done. Less melody, not as many catchy parts in the songs. I found a lot of what was going on within the songs themselves to be very distracting, making it very hard for me to listen to, at least, and kind of very off-putting in that regard. Funny thing is, vocalist Robert Smith actually says that this one here is his favorite album. So, case in point, I think, we have an artist doing something that he wanted to do, maybe getting tired of things, and unfortunately it just didn't translate to the fans. Next one, Def Leppard, X from 2002, but it's their 8th studio album, not their 10th, so I think that they chose the X. It was 10 in the sense that they had a greatest hits and some other stuff, or I don't know quite how they came to that determination, but either way, it was their 8th studio album. This was follow-up to their return to form album Euphoria, which had actually gone platinum in 1999, and for a band coming out of the 80s like this, that was no small feat, doing very well for them. And that one there had returned them to their signature sound, but this one here was a big departure from that. And another band that attempted to modernize with the times and things of that nature, but they also brought in outside songwriters, and I think that was a big misstep here. First of their albums to feature songs not written by the band as well. So essentially doing cover songs on here, some of these, sounding much more like boy bands at the time, and I kind of got it at the time, with all the harmonizing and great vocals that Def Leppard did, being one of what they said at the time was an original boy band. It just was far too pop sounding, I think, and it's just one that I know myself, and I think a lot of fans, it's the last of their albums for you to go back to if you're going to reach for one off of the shelf. All right, next one, Duran, Thank You from 1995, 8th studio album, follow-up to their self-titled 1993 comeback album that had gone platinum, had returned them to the top of the charts. And then here, 2 years later, they put this thing out. It's all cover songs, so that's the first kind of thing that was just kind of crazy. This covers albums were not a big thing back in 1995. That had not caught on yet for bands, so that was a little bit of a misstep right there in and of itself. But the head scratcher is the song selections that are on here, ranging from Public Enemy rap, Krista Berg pop, Gary Glitter glam rock, Bob Dylan folk, and Led Zeppelin classic rock. So with that, it's just sort of, they're all over the map on here. And even though they did attempt to put the Duran stamp on each of these tracks, for me at least, it was so spread out across the different genres and, musical map of the world, so to speak. I just cannot listen to this. It's just too all over the place. All right, I think one of the biggest all-time album fails would be this one right here. Even though I actually love the album, Guns N' Roses' Chinese Democracy from 2008, their 6th studio album and follow-up to the hugely successful multi-platinum albums Use Your Illusions. And this one here taking 17 years for them to do, you can either look at that as it should have been the absolute best album ever, or because it took 17 years, so many missteps happened along the way that they just added up to an album that couldn't possibly do anything at the time. And at the time when it came out, it barely made gold. Since then, it's actually gone platinum, and I think it has a lot to do with current lineup of Guns N' Roses playing a number of these in concert, giving it some rejuvenation, and people now having been able to step back from it for a number of years, in fact 15 years at this point, and can see that it's not quite as bad as people initially thought. But down to one original member, Axl Rose at this point. They did have Dizzy Reed in the lineup, who had been with them since 1991, and ultimately just criticized for its production with too many layered parts in it, making it hard to know exactly what was going on in each song. And I completely agree with all of those assessments, but in the end of the day, when I can separate it from Appetite and Use Your Illusion, I actually really like the album as its own thing. But as a Guns N' Roses album, no. In fact, it is not, and turns out to be a big misstep. Next up, Billy Idol, Cyberpunk from 1993, 5th studio album, follow-up to the platinum-selling Charmed Life. I've never seen an artist blow up their career as fast as Billy Idol did here. And the reason I'm saying that is not like he was this huge artist specifically, but he was part of the alternative rock movement. And in 1993, when this album was coming out, alternative rock was king. You know, and not only that was just that he, instead of trying to stick with that, and the fact that he's coming from the punk world into the alternative rock world, punk was about to be king again in 1994, he decides to change his sound, going with techno and dance and making anything but a punk album. So the name Cyberpunk throws you off. Then you hear this. It doesn't sound anything like that. It doesn't sound anything like what Billy Idol had done before this, and it just was something that I know turned off a lot of fans at the time, and it ended up being a very long time before he started making albums again. All right, next one. Megadeth, Risk, from 1999, 8th studio album, follow-up to the gold-selling Cryptic Writings. And so over the few years prior to this, Megadeth had been going a little more contemporary, or a little more pop, however you want to kind of think about it, a little more radio-friendly, let's call it that. And it had been working to their advantage. They had done Countdown to Extinction, they had done Euthanasia, they then did Cryptic Writings, and they were continuing on with the success that they had had, and that was cool. They were changing with the times, one of the few bands to do it. Unfortunately, this one here, where they attempted to really merge the modern day sounds, I think they went too far, and it ended up backfiring on them. So instead of them getting more popular, they became less popular with it, just making a huge miscalculated step with this one. Okay, and the last one, and again, along with Chinese Democracy, this one here might also be the biggest fail of them all. Metallica, Saint Anger, from 2003, 8th studio album, follow-up to Load and Reload, with combined sales of 8 million copies between those two albums. You know, this album here followed on a very tumultuous period for the band, and that was all caught and documented on Some Kind of Monster. So we know about all of that, but you know, this one here, again, it's like the band went to eliminate their trademark sound. They eliminated guitar solos. They eliminated the production value from their previous albums. And it was just sort of a very big head scratcher as to why they were doing this. What would be the reason behind it? And, you know, the 90s was kind of a lost, you know, era, or a lost period for a lot of bands. And coming out the other side of it, bands didn't really know what to do. And Metallica was just one of such bands. Now, this album would ultimately sell 2 million copies, but it would be a far cry from what their other albums would do. And it really started the downward spiral to where, you know, album sales and things of that nature are just not what they once were for Metallica, who was just an, you know, all out of the gate kind of a band originally. And so, you know, you've got certain albums within this that were successful, certain albums that were not, but in the end, I think all of the albums that we covered from these 10 here were album fails, and not living up to the sort of status and, you know, style of the bands that we know and love. And, you know, it is what it is. And I think you guys will have your own opinions on these. I'm sure you'll have ones that you want to throw in on that. Remember that tomorrow we'll be posting a part 2 of this video here, where I will pick up with the letter M and continue through the rest of the alphabet. But if you've got ones to suggest that fall into the A through M categories for here, feel free to go ahead and let me know. Otherwise, tune in tomorrow and continue on watching the biggest album fails from the last 40 years. All right, everyone, take care, have a good one, and I'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.